religious freedom doesn't just happen. It has to be created. It's not courageous to say, I believe something everyone's always believed. It is courageous to say, I believe this in spite of the fact that, there might not be thus and such supporting it.
Today on In Good Faith, I'm pleased to be speaking with author and teacher Adam Jortner, who was until recently the Goodwin Philpott Eminent Professor of Religion in the Department of History at Auburn University, specializing in the history of religion in the American Revolution and the early nation. More about that in just a minute. But first, Adam, you're speaking to me, I believe, from your home in Nova Scotia.
Yes, that's right, Steve. We're up here. I'm up here doing my next project, which is on Canadian revivals. Canada had the largest Christian revivals anywhere in the British world during the American Revolution. So we're investigating why the revivals are in a loyalist province.
Today, we're going to talk about one of your books. You've published The Gods of Prophetstown, a study of Native American religion, deism, and military conflict in the Old Northwest. Blood from the Sky, A History of Miracles in the Early Republic. Gods of Prophetstown won the 2013 James Broussard Prize for the best first book in early American history. Congratulations.
Thanks very much.
And today we're discussing this new book, A Promised Land, which is about Jewish patriots, the American Revolution, and the development of religious freedom. And just right off the bat, when we think of the Revolutionary War, because we are that removed from it, we're not thinking, yes, and the Catholics fought, and there were some Muslims, and I have never heard anyone talk about contributions of early Jewish patriots. Did you always know that history, or how did you discover it and feel compelled to share those stories?
I was stunned to find it out about 10 years ago. I was working on a different project, and about Judaism. And in the 1800s, I was like, well, let me read it back to see what was going on around the revolution. Thinking that I would find lots of anti-Semitism, the Jews not getting a fair shot. And I found exactly the opposite. The American Revolution actually increases opportunities for Jews, lets them achieve citizenship right off the bat in the new United States, and actually allows them to serve in the military and even as officers, which is something Jews couldn't do in Europe for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, not since the Roman Empire. And that sort of brought me into trying to figure out, okay, we need to know more about this. Just the very fact that there are Jewish patriots in the American Revolution, that the revolution is important for the American Jews who are living in the colonies at the time of independence, and that by and large, the American Jews support the revolution enthusiastically. And the revolution sort of supports them back. And this is one of the pillars on which full citizenship, religious citizenship is created. It's one of the pillars on which we build freedom of religion as we understand it in this country.
And you bring out in the book that the idea of, and we don't have to go too deeply into this is not the history I'm after, but the idea of Christian nation or founding as a Christian nation came about in the early 1800s. That was not the thinking in the 1770s.
Right. And let me be clear what I mean here. When people say America is a Christian nation, what I'm talking about is there are people who claim that America was founded by Christians, meaning evangelical Christians, for Christians. That is to say, the country was made by Christians. It was made for Christians. Christians are the first and fullest citizens, and Christianity is kind of an unspoken agreement among the people of the early republic. The fact that Jews are there proves all of those things, historically speaking, are not true. The founders are not all Christian. They do not require people to be Christian, and they even promote, they do what Christians didn't do in Europe. They promote Jews to officer status. Jews get elected to public office in the early years of the American Republic. That had Never happened. It couldn't happen in Europe. And what you have is the story of, well, this is a Christian nation made exclusively for Christians, is really something that people start to come up with about 50 or 60 years after the revolution. And again, let me be clear. Many of the founders are devout Christians. George Washington is doesn't make a lot of public utterances about it, but he is a very strong Christian. John Witherspoon comes to mind, Benjamin Rush, these guys. But there's a difference between being a Christian and saying that America is for Christians first and foremost. And again, what I'm saying here is this is not historically accurate as it applies to the revolution. If you think the America begins in the revolution, then we have to accept that it was religiously diverse. And actually, I can prove to you historically that that religious diversity worked for the United States. In fact, it's more likely that we won the war because of that diversity.
You even mentioned a battle in South Carolina, Beaufort, I think, where what was called the Jew Battalion of the militia, 28 of the 40 soldiers were Jewish in that particular battalion.
Right. Beaufort still has now a strong Jewish community, and they turn out to serve in the militia. And they're nicknamed the Jew Company. They called themselves, however, the Free Citizens. So they thought of themselves, they didn't think of themselves, well, we're Jews fighting for America. They said, we're Americans. We're free now. And this is our responsibility as citizens, as members of the Republic. And that's a big shift because prior to 1776, in the colonies and throughout the European Christian world, Jews are not citizens. They're not subjects. They're residents. They don't have the same rights, even to the extent that rights exist under a king, right? They don't have the same rights as a Christian does. And the revolution flips that.
Well, so many questions, but I'd like to know, is there some document or thing you learned in the research or the writing process that really had the most impact on you?
I think what really made me want to do this project, and I said, this has to be a book. I spent 10 years working on this thing. There is a synagogue in Philadelphia. And of course, over the course of the early, let me take that again. There is a book that contains all of the constitutions of the early American states. And it contains the Articles of Confederation and the Declaration of Independence. And that book was printed in 1783. We still have the copy that the people at the synagogue Mikveh Israel of Philadelphia bought and annotated. They went through, and again, the Mikveh Israel is a really important synagogue because most Jews in the colonies live in only five cities with a synagogue or with a Jewish community: Savannah, Charleston, Philly, New York, and Newport, Rhode Island. All those places, except for Philadelphia, are knocked over by the British by 1778. So Jews who are patriots, who want to continue to live as Jews, and who can afford it, go to Philadelphia. So and that's different than what Christians have, because Judaism, you need some stuff, for lack of a better words. You need to have a Torah. You need to have a space that's been blessed. This is something Methodists, I don't want to pick on Methodists, but Methodists, Baptists, Protestants, they just go anywhere. You see what I mean. The Jews go to Philadelphia. They refound Mikveh Israel as a national patriot organization. They create a board of trustees that is created from all over the country. They hire a Hazan, a leader of the synagogue from New York, another guy from Philly to be the president, and they create kind of a national Jewish organization. And then when the war is over, when they've won, then they go in and they take this book of constitutions and they begin to go through to determine what are the rights of Jews in each of the states. And they make little marks and they make little notations, and we still have that. And looking through that, I began to see, these guys, these early Americans were not just interested in a vague sense of religious freedom. They were serious about it, and they wanted to say, we have served, we are equal under the law, and therefore we should have the same religious rights. And in every state that has a Jewish community, all of the test oaths fall away by the 1792. And of course, a test oath is a constitutional agreement. You have to swear to believe something, not to protect, not just I will protect the state, I will fulfill my oath of office, but usually it's something like I believe in the Old and New Testaments, or sometimes if you want to exclude Catholics, you have to say I believe in the Old and New Testaments, but not the Pope, that sort of thing. And of course, these were used to keep Jews out of public office. And again, what's remarkable is there's test oaths in almost every constitution in 1776. Within 15 years, every place with a Jewish congregation, every place where it would have mattered, that goes away. Which indicates, and again, the Jews are not, it's not the voting power of the Jewish community here. They're like 0.1%. They're a tiny, tiny minority. So it's not just about what the Jews wanted, it's about how American patriots in the Revolution thought about religious diversity or thought about freedom of religion. They might not agree with Judaism, but they wanted to create a democracy where what someone believed did not stop them from serving in office, where citizens had the right to determine for themselves how they would or would not worship God.
Well, there are a few really interesting characters that jumped out to me, and I want to ask you about some of your favorites. One, just sort of in passing, when he joined the Revolutionary Army, Elias Pollock, he decides, well, I don't know how they're going to feel about Jews, so he joins under the name Joseph Smith, which within 50 years would be problematic in different ways for him. But there's a particular name I'd love to ask you about. He's sort of known because of what he does in Philadelphia, you say, as the Rabbi of the Revolution. Gershom Satius?
Yeah, Gershom Satius.
Gershom.
He's a really fascinating guy, and one of the really critical Jewish and American leaders at the time. He is, there's no rabbis in the early United States, because to be a rabbi, you have to go to yeshiva. And as you may imagine, there are no yeshivas anywhere in the New World in 1776. So what Gershom is a hazan, which is to say a sort of community leader, but he functions like a rabbi. There are other details. Look, for those of you who are really into Jewish law, you can send me an email and I'll get into the differences. But he functions like a rabbi. People call him a rabbi. And he becomes the head of the New York congregation, the New York Synagogue, a couple years before the Revolution. And then, 1776, Congress calls for Christian ministers to offer a day of fasting and prayer. And Satius decides to join them. He says, well, I don't know, we don't have a letter from him, but obviously he didn't feel that being Jewish was a barrier to have him have a day of fasting and prayer at his synagogue to offer up prayers to God along with his Christian fellow colonists. So he does that, and then a few months later, independence is declared. The British Army is bearing down on New York. Satius takes one of the Torahs from the synagogue, and he and most of his congregation head out to Connecticut. They're going to live in exile, which is significant. There's no real threat that the British are necessarily going to come in and shut down the synagogue. Maybe, but there's no indication of that. So they must have been moving for patriot reasons. We do not want to live under British rule. We want to live under American patriot rule. And to go to Connecticut at the time was it was maybe the least Jewish place in all of the colonies. I think Hartford had a Jew street, but it didn't have any Jews in it. So they went to a very, a Gentile place, and they set themselves up sort of in exile. Eventually they head down to Philadelphia, where he becomes the Hazan of Mikveh Israel. And ultimately, it's Gershom Seixas who sort of leads the way in bringing Mikveh Israel to advocate for Jewish rights, to petition for Jewish rights. Um, when there is a big celebration of the passing of the Constitution, Gershom Seixas is selected to walk in the parade with the rest of the Christian
Mm.
ministers, and people are like, "Wow, this is great. Look at how America is burying the arguments of the old world in its new republic." And that this is sort of the rhetoric people of the time are using. And indeed, at the end of the parade, when everybody stops for lunch, there is actually a kosher table reserved for Sicius and for the Jews. So again, the Jews are not a big part of the population, but people are aware of them, and they go out of their way to make sure that the Jews are included, that there is going to be not just religious toleration, but religious freedom.
I think you mentioned it was at the rededication of Mikvah Israel, the synagogue in Philadelphia, that they actually have a dedicatory prayer. It's in Hebrew, but the beginning letter over on the right spells out line by line, starts with the letters Washington.
Yes, I believe that one is actually made in Richmond by the New Richmond Synagogue. The early Jews loved Washington, and they spell out in Hebrew letters Washington as one of their dedicatory prayers. And of course they make sure everybody knows this. They don't just do it personally. But again, one of the critical documents in American religious freedom is the letter of the Newport Synagogue to Washington in 1791, and Washington's letter back. And the Moses Seixas, Gershom's brother, is the head of that synagogue, and they write to President Washington at the time, and they say, "We have been denied the rights of freemen, and we are hoping that this new country of yours will give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance." And Washington writes back and he says, "You're absolutely right. This is a government that gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance." And indeed, he says, this should be a place where all we ask is that you demean yourself as good citizens, and we're not going to check your religious qualifications. There are no religious qualifications to be a member, to be a citizen of the United States. Again, it's quite remarkable. It is exactly the opposite of what certain people dedicated to Christian nationalism say that Washington wanted. Washington has pretty broad views about it. And so American Jews and American synagogues are often, they write several letters to Washington, and they're sort of full of praise of him. And I should point out, when Washington is writing to small religious minority, he's very fulsome. He's very, when he writes to the Baptists, they were small then. Baptists or Catholics or the Swedenborgians, he has similar effusive language. "We want you. We're glad you're here." When he writes to, when the big denominations like Congregationalists or Presbyterians write to him, he's a lot more circumspect.
I'm curious if there is. Do you have a hero or two in this story? People that you sort of like, gosh, if I could meet this person, they are so interesting. I'd really love to sit down and talk with them.
I'll say this. I'll say I have heroes from history, but they're not the people. They're not usually the people I study, because you don't necessarily want to study your heroes just because you need to be objective about these guys. And the reality is there are a lot there are Jews in the Revolution who fight for religious freedom who are also slaveholders. And we, sort of coming to grips with that is also part of what we talk about. Mordecai Sheftall in Georgia is a very prominent patriot, holds a lot of offices among the Georgia Sons of Liberty, later for the American Army. But one of the most interesting things about Mr. Sheftall is that he also supported the creation of an African Baptist church in Savannah, one of the deacons was named Adam Sheftal. And the relationship between Mordecai Sheftal and Adam Sheftal is not clear. Um, so we need to, these are things that we need to also remember.
I'm curious about your background growing up. Was yours an observant house, and sort of just your walk and your faith journey, your path through life?
Well, I was raised in a Jewish household, insofar as any household in Southwest Virginia can be a Jewish household, which is to say, um, reform minded.
Hmm.
My father came from an Orthodox background, from Brooklyn, but he got work in far Southwest Virginia, so that's where we went. Um, and I would say for me, I'll stop there. I don't.
No, that's fine. Were you did you go to synagogue on a regular basis, or was it more of a cultural identity?
What a great question. One of the things I teach about is that often in the United States, a Jew from Council Bluffs, Iowa, and a Muslim from Council Bluffs, Iowa, will have more in common with each other than, say, a Jewish person from Detroit or a Muslim person from Detroit. Which is to say, anyone who's in a religious minority in the United States often has similar experiences, which is to say, we had a synagogue that we went to, and we went pretty faithfully. We very pretty observant of the holidays, um, but we also didn't live in we also lived in a world where you there are hamburgers are available, but you don't the cheeseburger is there, but you can't have it. And I remember reading this is a offbeat story, but if you ever read the Ms. Marvel comics, um, uh, um, one of the first moments when you see Ms. Marvel, who's of course a Muslim American in New Jersey, one of the first things she's doing is she's staring at the hot dogs at the 7-Eleven going, infidel meat. And that's a feeling I recognize instantly being like, when I'd be like, man, I really want to eat that cheeseburger. So I did have a Jewish upbringing, but it was, it is in some ways sort of catch as catch can. I certainly feel we did not have a regular rabbi growing up, but I got a fairly, I felt like I got a fairly extensive Jewish education. I learned to read Hebrew, that sort of thing.
Did you have, as a young person or as you've traveled along through life, a sense of a reality of the divine or of God and some connection?
I think, Steve, for me, the reality of God is something that I thought myself into, or if you want to say God was leading me to think myself into, um, which is to say, I'm highly skeptical of experiential religion for myself. I do not deny that other people may have experiences of God that I haven't had, and I would not say those are. I'm not going to say it's not legitimate because it didn't happen to me, because that doesn't make any sense. Um, but for me, I struggled with my faith for some times. I struggled with the ways in which many religions, not just Judaism, but many forms of Christianity as well, often felt more exclusive than inclusive. By which I mean, I would often feel like I was being tested whenever I went into a holy space for worship. I felt like there was a certain standard that I was supposed to hit. And I think it was after, I mean, I became a Christian after about 20 years of studying it. So, the, the long game. And ultimately, I think my faith came about after I thought about it for long enough, and I always had told myself that I ever came up with a reason for belief, that would be good enough for me. And to me, what is convincing about the scriptures is the message of Christ, which is to say, I believe that Jesus is talking about something that other religions, well, I'll put it this way: I have not yet met another religious prophet who talked about forgiving your neighbors and who says the problem here is not about good versus evil. The problem here is about asking God for forgiveness, which is to say, the proper response is to say, Lord, forgive me, have mercy on me, a sinner. And that is the reason why I believe in the resurrection. Many people, I know, for many folks that will sound weird or that will sound impossible, and that's I'm okay with that. Um, and as I said, other people have had, there's nothing super dramatic about my story. Um, but it was sort of coming to really sort of understand the life of Christ that I came to believe in the resurrection. And again, it is an odd thing to say because this did happen to me while I was researching a book on Judaism. But in essence, it was sort of, that thought wasn't going to go anywhere, so I just
No, that's fine. You know, because you do work and teach as a historian, how is that tied to your faith? Or what effect has that had? Or is that what had brought you to study the things you do?
I mean, I think being a person of faith makes doing history a little bit more challenging. Because one thing that is true, one thing that I believe, is that, and I'm pretty sure I can prove it to you through examples. People don't believe things because they're true. And this is one of the great mysteries of life. Because again, if you think about it, if people only believed the things that were true, there would be no disagreements in the whole world because we all would have seen whatever the right idea was. And then we go forward. So as a historian of the church, I don't think it's my job to go around and say, and then this person, what Steve, no, you're Steve. Sorry, Steve is just the generic name I use.
That's fine. Go for it.
We don't say, Tom was right, and that's why people followed him, and Sally was wrong, and that's why people didn't flock to her. What you have is a world of people who are trying to understand different religious ideas and are searching for the truth. The history of the church is not a history of truth necessarily. Because again, you can say Jesus Christ was the same yesterday, today, and always, but the church has changed. The church is a human institution, and so what we do when we study the history of the church is, I think we're studying the ways in which Christians meet the world, of the ways that they succeed and the ways that they fail, and what we are looking for is ways other people have thought about God. And I think we're supposed to take those very seriously and very carefully. For many centuries, the argument, is, well, if they were Christian, they must have been a good person. And let's find out ways that Christians were successful. And normally in these histories, the Christians are successful by killing a lot of people. There's a really old book called Ecclesiastical History of Britain, by a guy named Venerable Bede. It's a great book. It's still worth reading. But he talks about how, and this one group of Britons, they got baptized and they were still wet, and then they won a big battle. And he, of course, says because they got hit with the water, that gave them the power to win the battle, which is not, I think, consistent. To me, is not consistent with what Jesus says in the New Testament. But the goal here is to sort of think about that. and to sort of again, not to sort of go around and being like, this person's a Christian, therefore they're good, because Christianity has as one of its fundamental tenets that we're all bad. We're all going to make mistakes. And anyone who has spent any time in any kind of Christian institution will know that Christians fail repeatedly and sometimes magnificently. That failure doesn't make the religion untrue. But it is something to sort of that I think helps us to think about, and I think it is also helpful to use that to realize that people have believed different things in the past. That the story of the church and indeed the story of the United States isn't just us in funny costumes. That they really believed in different things. Baptists used to be ferocious about drinking alcohol. And as someone who teaches at an SEC school, I feel that is not as strongly emphasized, anymore. There used to be, enormous conflicts between Protestants and Christians over what exactly happens in the Eucharist. I'm going to go out on a limb here. Most American Protestants and Catholics could not tell you the difference between a Lutheran point of view and a Catholic point of view. And that's not a criticism. It is just to say these things used to be much bigger issues, and now that has turned around. And we need to, I think one of the most important Christian lessons is to remember what is good, what Christians have considered to be good and evil, the positions we take are not consistent through time, which just means, which is not to say there's no such thing as good or evil, but it is to say you can't justify what you're talking about just by saying, well, this is what Christians have always believed. There isn't one, as I said, there's lots of different churches. And I think that's an important, to me, I think that is an important piece of faith because it teaches humility, and sort of in that humility to remember to be courageous. It's not courageous to say, I believe something everyone's always believed. It is courageous to say, I believe this in spite of the fact that, there might not be thus and such supporting it.
Yeah. If I look at stories of the Revolution, finding accounts of the women other than perhaps Abigail Adams because of her famous correspondence with her husband is a little bit hard, but you do feature several women in this book. I wonder if you might tell a story about one of those.
There are a number of women in the Revolution and right after who really affect and transform the American Jewish community. There are also some non-Jewish women who I get to in the book. Just have to point this out. There is a woman named Deborah Sampson who actually dresses as a man and fights in the Revolution as an army ranger and is later celebrated for this. And she spends a lot of her life after the Revolution going around proving she can put a rifle together and all sorts of interesting things. Again, just to give you, that's not something we normally associate with the Revolution, but it was there. Again, a lot of what we know about the American Revolution doesn't come from actual history of the Revolution. It comes from sort of just thinking, well, it was old time and they fought and they won. We don't know a lot about it. Now, in terms of Jewish women, there are a number of ways in which religious freedom transforms their position and they, in turn, transform religious freedom. And one of the most important is Rebecca Gratz, who is born during the Revolution and lives for about 60 years in this first sort of era of religious freedom for Jews. One of the things religious freedom does for Jews is that for the first time in centuries, Jews are finally able to respond to Christians. Because, of course, in Europe in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period, Jews literally were legally prohibited from saying anything critical about Christianity. That would be blasphemy and you could get killed. You could have the death penalty. Under conditions of religious freedom, Jews are actually able to respond to Christianity. One thing Rebecca Gratz does is she begins writing works for Jews and specifically for Jewish children that emphasize here this is what Judaism is and this is why we believe it. She begins to write what are called apologetic works, which is to say defenses of the faith, which can be used in all kinds of synagogues. And she actually finds a way to produce these things, get them printed up and sent around to synagogues. And actually, when she wanted to get Bibles in translation for her, she starts Jewish Sunday schools. Obviously, Christians start Sunday schools first, thus the name Sunday school. But she sort of catches on and says, well, we should have this as well. And she actually contacts the American Bible Society for copies of the Bible, and then she just removed the New Testament. She's a remarkable figure. There are also a number of women who get involved in sort of staking out defenses of religion. Rachel Mordecai is an interesting one. She becomes very prominent in Jewish and Christian circles for responding to Jewish stereotypes that she sees in literature. She reads these books, and Jews are presented, as shysters and as evil landlords. And she says, "Look, this isn't the way we are." And her letters about this begin to get published and circulated. Interestingly enough, she will ultimately convert to Christianity. But again, this is something that is happening in Judaism that couldn't happen before, which is that Jews are able to write their own defenses, their own thoughts on religious faith.
Adam, this book is really enlightening and brings so many new faces and new stories to the idea of the history of the revolution that I haven't known. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. Any last thoughts about just what religious freedom is and how unique it was with its beginnings, and how do you see that playing out today?
I think one thing I learned about religious freedom by studying the revolution, the Jews are not the only ones who push for these rights. Baptists push for them because they were legally discriminated against in Virginia and other places. Catholics push for rights. So I learned two important things. One is religious freedom doesn't just happen. It has to be created. You have to have people who push for it and are able to explain it to others. So if you treasure religious freedom, this is something worth talking about, and not in sort of a reactionary way, but to sort of say the reason why, and this is what the founding fathers talked about, if everyone is able to freely speak their mind on the topic of religion, what you will get is a society that is supporting each other, where again, differences of religion are not going to result in civil divisions. And what is more, James Madison pointed out that it was really only after freedom of religion that America kind of gets its reputation for being so religious. People probably went to church more after the First Amendment is passed than before. And we tend to think of like, well, everyone in the colonial period was probably a Puritan and they all went to church. That's because you had to go to church as a Puritan. It was the law. Of course people went to church. Otherwise you had to, wear a red letter on your shirt. What it does is it makes religion voluntary, and that allows a lot of different religious groups to grow, including the churches. And as James Madison also pointed out, if you have a state where the church where you're required to believe something in order to take a leading role or to take a position in the government, Madison says, what do you do then? The oath doesn't hold anybody. Someone who doesn't believe in God can take that oath, no problem. A person who doesn't mind violating oath, a bad person, can instantly get into government, but someone with ethics who has a personal core couldn't. And I think it's quite amazing to me that, again, not only did Jews fight for the revolution, become officers, they actually become elected officials in the United States. That's when European visitors come over, they're floored by the fact that a Jewish guy could be a town councilman. So I think that's a lesson for us today: is that it is a positive good that has to be worked for. One more thing that I would say about religious freedom, and I've learned this is that religious freedom is something, I think, one of our most valuable things. If you can't convince someone without the power of the state behind you, you're not really preaching. That's an old Baptist point of view, right? If you offer someone, hey, you can be a U.S. senator if you take this oath, or we will not shoot you if you take this oath. Well, you're not really converting people. But having said that, that's a positive good. Religious unfreedom is something that is also taught. And I sort of I get into some of the sources of anti-Semitism in the book as well, although I think that's a minor key in the 1780s, 1790s. But one thing that is true is anti-Semitism is learned. There are books about anti-Semitism. There are books with anti-Semitic ideas. There are now websites with anti-Semitic ideas. There are social media posts with anti-Semitic ideas. Same thing is true for anti-Mormonism, anti-Catholicism, Islamophobia, which is to say there are people who are organized to spread misinformation about people's faiths, to say these religions are not real religions, they are plots against you. And it is incumbent upon the rest of us not only to condemn these things, but to point out why those are not true, and to make the case that different faiths make us stronger, even if we don't agree with them, which is to say, we are a stronger nation, I believe, if we have a place where a Muslim can worship freely, and a Hindu can worship freely, and an evangelical Christian can worship freely, and we can work together. And that does not mean that Islam and Hinduism and Christianity are the same. It doesn't mean that they are all theologically true. It means that if a religion is a private good, then people will join because of what they believe, not because of what the state has to say. So it behooves us to sort of keep an eye on that. And this is very important in our own communities. I say this all the time. It's great if you have a screed you want to release on Twitter or whatever. It's even better if you hear someone saying something or referencing something that tells an untruth about someone else's religion or tells an untruth about religious freedom, to answer them and to speak freely about that. That's way more important than getting angry online.
Amen. Speaking with Adam Jortner, he's a professor, he's a historian, he's the author of several books. One we've just been discussing is A Promised Land, about Jewish patriots, the American Revolution, and development of religious freedom here in the U.S. What a pleasure to hear from you, and good luck with your current research and what's coming up next.
Thanks, Steve. It's been an honor.